Hello and welcome to podcast number 25 from the Self-Publishing Formula.
Two writers, one just starting out, the other a bestseller. Join James Blatch and Mark Dawson and their amazing guests as they discuss how you can make a living telling stories. There's never been a better time to be a writer.
Hey Mark, we've reached a quarter of a century.
My goodness, that's amazing.
I know.
How did that happen?
I don't know. It's like 50 home runs in a season, something like that, or waving your bat for a quarter of a century, which we don't, even in cricket, which people don't understand outside of England and the Commonwealth, we don't even celebrate 2025, but we're going to celebrate it today. It's been a blast. We're enjoying it. We've had some great guests on. Every single podcast has been a good learning experience. I thought Deepesh was great last week, somebody who obviously is a professional in the sense that, you know, we always say you should be professional and aim for high standards, but the truth is we're at home running our businesses, doing what we think's right. And this guy, Deepesh, he goes into companies that have millions of pounds, millions of dollars invested in them, and he sits there and he takes over their advertising campaign on social media, and he's helped launch and make hugely successful quite a few companies. So I thought it was really interesting hearing from him. And that hot tip about advertising in the summer right now being a good place. It does fluctuate, of course, through those weeks. But as we mentioned last week, we've definitely picked up some good bargains in bids online. And Mark, talking of doing stuff online and getting some bargains, you've had a Bookbub.
I did, yeah. So it's always interesting when you get a Bookbub. I've had, I don't know how many now, certainly double figures, maybe 15 or 20 over the course of the last 3 or 4 years. And if you take time to look on the usual forums, there are often posts that suggest that Bookbub ads are less effective now than they were. And to an extent, that's probably true. When I started doing them, they probably returned slightly more in terms of the return on investment. But even saying that, they're still easily the most powerful form of advertising outside of social media advertising that you can have. And I had a deal for the first John Milton box set that went out and sold something like 5,000 copies on Amazon at 99 cents. So that's 35% royalty. So not a huge amount of money, but still with everything combined was more than enough to make a positive return on the cost of the advert. But the effect on rankings was very impressive. It got to number 11 overall in the Amazon.com store and a similar kind of level over here at .co.uk. And also did really, really well on all of the other platforms. So nearly 1,000 copies sold on Barnes & Noble, I think 700 on Kobo, something similar on Apple. So I'm not a big one for checking kind of the bestseller list, but I'm almost certain that would have hit the USA Today bestseller list somewhere within the top 100. And it's not impossible that it might have hit the New York Times list as well. So that's a pretty good testimony for how powerful Bookbub ads still are today.
Yeah, powerful in that sense. So although you may have only made a couple of $1,000 on the direct ad, the visibility you gained from it was even more hugely valuable.
Yeah, and there are other benefits too, of course. So I had a big spike in sign-ups to my mailing list since that deal has run. And because I'm offering, it's a 3-book set, so it will take people a little while to get through those books, but I've already seen a spike in sales of the second box set. And that's something that I would expect to see continue over the next few months, because at the end of the day, those are almost certainly new readers. They probably haven't bought a John Milton book before, because why would they have bought the box set? And that just means that provided the writing holds up, and my read-through rates tend to be pretty good, that should mean once they get to the end of the third book in the box set, they'll be looking for the second box set with the next 3 books and then the next 3 books after that. So what hopefully will happen is that will just continue the production line of new readers who'll chew through the rest of the series, and then on to my other series too.
So Bookbub still alive and kicking. Just a quick word on the Bookbub ads. Have you been using that more since we first spoke to Bookbub? And I know you're one of the beta testers of that.
I have, yeah. So I'm kind of winding them down a bit now. The thing with Bookbub ads is they're very powerful to start with when you're fresh, but you will chew through the audience a lot quicker than you would, say, for Facebook. Facebook is obviously a vast platform compared to Bookbub. My experience so far has been that you'll get a really excellent return on investment for the first couple of weeks, and then it will start to tick down. So what needs to happen when that takes place is you just got to think, okay, that ad is probably a little bit stale now. It's time to either change up the ad, offer something else, or wait until you've got something else to sell and then go back and advertise it again. But my experience so far has been very positive with those ads. It's a platform that clearly works. people who've suggested that seeing those ads at the bottom of the Daily Mail out won't lead to clicks, they're wrong, because it certainly does, and I've made a decent amount of money on those ads.
Good. Fresh produce works best in that environment.
Absolutely. Yep.
Now, talking of bestsellers, how excited are we? We have probably the biggest indie author that we've ever had on the Self-Publishing Formula podcast. An absolute giant, in fact, a legend of this parish, somebody who's dominated with her books. And we're very, very excited, aren't we, to have Barbara Freethy.
Yeah, Barbara's been a really massive seller for a long time now. Very, very experienced author who's done everything, really. So we were really thrilled that she was prepared to take time out of her schedule to talk with you, James. And this is going to be an interview I think will be of a lot of interest to everybody.
So, Barbara Freethy is one of the best-selling indie authors on the planet. She's had 18 of her books in the bestsellers list. She's sold millions of novels. In fact, Barbara is the Amazon KDP best-selling author of all time. She writes romance, and after a pretty decent traditionally published career in 2011, she moved into self-publishing. And, I think it's fair to say, Barbara, you haven't looked back?
I have not looked back, that's for sure.
So tell us a little bit about that start, just before 2011 then. So you were traditionally published. You went through a couple of publishers, I think.
Yes, I actually worked for 4 out of the big 5 traditional publishers across many years. Certainly had my ups and downs in my traditional publishing career. I had moments of almost greatness and then lots of mediocrity. So I definitely saw the peaks and the valleys of that path to publishing. And I was working with pocketbooks back in 2010, 2011, when the ebook revolution sort of began. And I decided I had actually gotten some rights back to some of my earlier traditionally published books. And I decided that I would start self-publishing by publishing some of those books. And it was definitely a lot harder back then. There was just very little information about how to do anything. So I was, scouring the internet for any kind of how-to guide. I think I read Smashwords Guide was one of the first ones that was available. And then I took some Photoshop tutorials so I could learn how to make a cover, and learned how to make an ebook, and learned what DRM meant, and, kind of all the little things that, really weren't being talked about back in the day. So it was kind of a scary new adventure to begin, but it was also very exciting.
So what went wrong with the traditionally published career then? You say you had a rocky time. What were the problems?
In publishing, there are always little things called glitches. That's kind of a popular term in traditional publishing. So I was publishing right along, but one of my last books had a really poor distribution glitch, as they called it, in that it didn't get into one of the major retail chains the first 2 weeks of release. So I knew that that was going to be a huge issue, because whenever you have a problem like that, when they try to sell in your next book like 6 to 9 months later, no one remembers that there was a glitch. Only they look at the sales figures and say, well, she didn't sell very many books those first 2 weeks. So I knew that that was going to be a big issue going forward. And, quite frankly, I was very motivated by, my own financial needs, as probably a lot of people are. I had, 2 kids in college. It was very expensive. And I thought, things were a little bit rocky, and I really needed to take charge of my career. I had some great publishers and worked with some great editors. And I know that some of these things are sometimes truly just, errors and glitches, and, nobody's particularly, responsible or maliciously trying to hurt your career or anything like that. But things happen. And, the less control you have over something, the less opportunity you have to fix it. And back in that day, there was no opportunity to fix anything. So if there was a glitch, I couldn't do anything about it. I was really, paralyzed. And I had no opportunity to speak to any of the retailers or distributors. When you work with a traditional publisher, you really can only talk to your editor, and you have to rely on everyone else in the house to do everything for you. So if your branding is off, or pricing is off, or anything is off, you just don't have the control over it.
Frustrating. And it's amazing how many authors, traditionally published authors, will just deal with that frustration their whole time. But for you, you got to a point, I guess you got to the end of a deal, or you were at least had some commercial or some legal freedom to move into self-publishing and took your chance.
Right. Well, as I said, I did start with some backlist books because I was, I guess hybrid for a year or so. Back then I had another book to write and to put out on my contract. So I did that and met all my obligations with the options books. But the first book that I put as a self-published book was called Summer Secrets. And, it was a slow go. I think sometimes people think that, everybody takes a rocket ship to, the top really fast. It wasn't that fast for me. It was a couple months. I was kind of looking at that title, and I had, I think, 2 other titles up as well. And not much was happening. And for me, it actually started to take off first on Barnes and Noble, surprisingly, not Amazon. So you never know where your readers are. That's something I really like to tell authors, that you never know where you're going to kind of, get your start. So for me, it kind of started there. And then for some reason, then Amazon started to pick up a little bit after that. And that book ended up hitting #1 on the New York Times. And it was the first time an indie book had ever hit the New York Times, much less hit #1 on the Times. And it was, I tell you, very shocking to my publishing house. They didn't know what to say to me. They were stunned. They were not happy. I remember asking, well, can we put this on my next traditionally published book? Because I had one more to come out. And they said, we'll see. They just didn't, they just didn't trust it. They didn't understand it. In fact, I think the New York Times attributed the success to my former publisher, who had originally owned the rights, because they didn't know how to put a self-published author's name in that slot. So it was really kind of groundbreaking and fun. But I think because I had that opportunity, I kind of was playing around with it while I was still traditionally published. In some ways that slowed me down, because it kept me from kind of really going fast, because I still had all these obligations to meet. And then once I was finally free of those, I could really concentrate on the self-publishing side.
What an amazing moment in the history of self-publishing. There's almost the moment Titanic struck the iceberg and they're all standing around convincing each other that the boat can't sink.
In fact, one of the publishing vice presidents, I think, was talking to me, and he said, well, why didn't you give us that book to publish? And I was like, I tried to give you that book. I tried to sell that book. I mean, back in the day, backlist books had absolutely no merit or value to a traditional publisher. They had nothing to do with it. So it was kind of funny that it was ironic a little bit that, I had originally gotten my rights back because I thought I could sell them to someone else, but I couldn't sell them to someone else. But fortunately, I was, able to take advantage of that revolution, kind of as it was beginning.
Let's mention money in this, because you mentioned it yourself. That was one of the motivating factors for you. And, you will have noticed straight away, I'm guessing, with that book, the difference in revenue earned from a traditionally published book to a self-published book.
Oh, absolutely. It was very shocking. It was night and day. And I'll tell you, when I originally started, I was not a full-time writer. I actually had a little side job going to bring money in to help pay for our expenses. And so my first goal was just to be able to make enough to get rid of that other side job. So that was kind of, I didn't have like super high ambitions at that point. I just thought, oh, if I can just bring in a little extra money. And I remember when I first started realizing what, 70% was compared to what I was making on the traditional deal, which was the 25% of the 70%, and then paying an agent, because of course I had an agent because I was working in traditional. So there was just no comparison to the money. I didn't have to even sell as many books to make more than I was making. So that was kind of a shocker there.
And when you see today, I mean, you move in circles which will include lots of traditionally published. I mean, you've won fairly prestigious awards, Barbara, which include traditionally published authors. Do you have that conversation with people who excitedly just signed a 3-book deal with whoever, and you sort of quietly think to yourself, is that the right move for you?
I try not to judge, because I know that everyone has their own path and they have to make their own decisions. I understand that for a lot of people, the lure of traditional publishing is very powerful. They really want to see their book on a bookstore shelf, and they feel that that's the way to get to that shelf. It really isn't as much anymore, because the traditional publishers can't put everybody on the shelves. Shelf space has diminished. And so, it's really difficult, even if you do sign a traditional deal, to get what you think you're going to get. And I think there's also sort of a myth that you're going to get a lot of marketing and they're going to do a lot for you. And that's not really true either, unless you're really at the top of the pile. I mean, publishing houses sell from the top down. So if you're in the top, 5 authors that they have on their list that month, then you're going to get marketing. But generally speaking, most new authors are much, much further down the list. So unless you have a really big advance, which means they've invested in you, you're really not going to get that much from your publishing experience. So, I do talk to a lot of people, and I do understand sometimes, why people make decisions they make. A lot of people want to hedge their bets. I have many traditionally published friends who have taken a long time to decide whether they even wanted to indie publish as a hybrid. And I kind of have a popular saying that I've said to them is that you can't swim across the pool if you don't let go of the wall. And that's what a lot of people do. They've got their hand on the wall, so they stay, they're kind of hedging their bets both ways. But it's really, really hard to see how successful you can be unless you kind of commit to it. I know a lot of traditional authors will say, well, I'm just going to write a novella and test the waters. And it's just never a good test, because if you're somebody who writes, full length books, traditionally, just throwing a novella into the indie waters is not going to tell you anything. So I think it's definitely a hard decision for people to make. And there's lots of reasons to do whichever path people want to do. And I totally understand sometimes financial needs are demanding. There's a lot of people who are addicted to that advance. That's how they plan their financial future. And so it's really hard to give that sure money up for, an unsure thing. But, the risk versus the reward, I mean, the reward is just huge on the indie side, of publishing.
Huge, but hugely satisfying as well. I can tell that you just by the fact that you were so frustrated of not having control, that you must be somebody who's enormously enjoyed taking control of that side of the career.
Yes, I had no idea really how much I liked being an entrepreneur until I really got out into my own business. I kind of write in between the lines of romance. I write kind of a straight romance, but I also add in a lot of mystery and suspense. And sometimes it was really hard for traditional publishers to know how to cover me. They would my books, they would always say, well, you don't really fit, the cover, of the day, which could have been the cartoon cover, or it could have been, really dark suspense, or it could have been, small town America, whatever was the cover of the day. I tended not to fit that particular brand. And so when I was able to go out on my own, I was able to really look at my brand and decide, well, I still believe that people like to read maybe more than just straight romance. Maybe there is this whole group of people who like a little bit of everything or a little bit of extra in their books. And so I was able to try to find a way to make my books stand out as uniquely mine, and they didn't necessarily fit the trend of the moment. So that was something that was really freeing. And also just being able to write whatever I wanted to write, to continue series. I had actually been asked to stop a series after 5 books when I was writing for Pocket. And I wish now that, I had like 10 more of that series, because people really want them. But on the traditional side, series are much more difficult, because in the print space, it's very hard for bookstores to keep more than, 1, 2, 3 books by an author on a shelf. And so it's much harder to sell series in a print space, because, the customer can't go to the store and find all the books. Whereas in, the e-world, you can definitely, series have become, the binge-worthy kind of series that take off, because you have the ability to buy all the books. So I think, being able to come into the indie space also allowed me, the creative freedom to write, what I really wanted to write, even though maybe it went against the traditional sense of what you should publish.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny how the constraints of the old industry and the advantage of the new one actually almost diametrically opposed in places. But as you say, series, it's such a natural thing in the ebook world to get to the end of a book and press a button and read the next one. And of course, that's why, from a marketing point of view, it works very well as well. Okay, well, let's dive into a little bit of detail, if you don't mind, Barbara. So there's early days when you were hopelessly typing things into search engines and not really coming up with very much, because you were one of the few pioneers at that time. So how did you start? Did you understand what a mailing list was at that point and realize you had to do that? When did you come to the mailing list idea?
The mailing list idea, actually, I came to before indie publishing. I think the irony for a lot of publishers is that in the kind of last couple of years of my traditional publishing career, really more and more social media marketing responsibilities were being passed to the author. So I was often sent an email by someone in the marketing department at the publisher telling me to, do something on my Facebook page, or set up this or set up that, or think about a blog tour. They weren't doing it for me. They just were going to tell me what I should do. So I did have a little bit of an idea of, that I did need to be collecting a mailing list. I will say it was definitely smaller back then. It was very organically grown, and it was mostly people who wrote to my website and or sent me an email, and I would add them to my mailing list. So I did have the idea back then that it was important, but certainly not to the extent that I have it today, of how really important it is to have the readers and the data, and to be able to reach those readers directly. Back then, when you're with a traditional publisher, you really are sort of prevented from, forming those kinds of relationships, not just with the reader, but the retailers and all of that, those kinds of partners that can help you. So I did have the mailing list idea earlier, but, it really took off probably in really even maybe the last 2 years. At the very beginning, I was so concentrated on how to really make the books and the brand and, how to release them. And I think really focused more on social media than my website, which is, I kind of have gone back and forth over my career. Is the website more important? Is social media more important? It seems like it changes a little bit every few years, and the strategy behind it.
When you did get going, funny enough, you say the last couple of years, really the mailing list has been a bigger part of your time. But I mean, now people will use whatever, Aweber and MailChimp and ConvertKit, etc. But in your early days, what were you gathering email addresses in a spreadsheet and hand delivering email almost?
The very early days, it was probably the Yahoo group was, kind of the email newsletter. And then I did switch over to, I had a couple of different systems. I think I had Vertical Response for a while, and then I switched over to MailChimp. I was definitely uploading spreadsheets. I think that a lot of authors make the mistake of really using the contest to drive the signups. And, while that's really appealing, I found that a lot of those subscribers really were pretty worthless in the long run. So I think in my early days, I would do some big giveaways with big, blog sites. And then they would, we'll give you everyone for your mailing list. But then, you find out really that they're not particularly the best subscriber, because they're really just there for the prize. So I think I've kind of learned a little bit more about, the value of the subscribers on your list in terms of, who's really, there for your books, who's just there for the free trip to Hawaii or whatever was being given. So I do still do some of those multi-author giveaways, but I don't do a lot, because I don't think that that's, really the best value to building your list.
So what has been the best value for you? Do you give away a book or two?
I do. I have done the giving away a free book in return for a sign up, or two books. I think I've done the first 2 books, starter books in a series. And those have been really proven to be very helpful. And also to advertise those kinds of signups, as you and Mark have really opened up the world to learning about that type of way into building the newsletter list. And that's been certainly a big help in growing things as well. And also just really making sure that the signups to my mailing list are everywhere. So they're, in every ebook front and back. They're, on my webpage, lots of places, big bold letters, lots of intriguing offers to buy into my list. I have kind of a varied list. So I have a lot of standalone books, because I come out of traditional publishing, and sometimes those are harder to sell in the indie space. So I have to try to find ways to, people come into my list a lot of different ways, whereas some writers, they have series right from the beginning. So it's very easy for them to pull people through their list. But I'll have somebody read a random standalone book, and then I don't know where they go next. So I'm trying to find ways to capture them wherever they might be.
Yeah, we should say that you and Mark, Mark helped you out with some campaigns, probably last year. Was that, Barbara?
Right. Last year was kind of the beginning. So yeah, we did work a little bit together, and I've taken his course and really learned a lot about the whole advertising space, which was not really part of my early, plans, because, again, it was still early days, and we weren't, really focusing as much on the advertising part of it as more the promotional part of it. So it's been interesting in the last, I think, year or two to see the advertising space kind of become more important.
And is advertising central to you today? You're doing a lot?
I'm really getting a little bit more involved in it, but I want to make sure that I really understand it. I think that's really easy to lose a lot of money on these sites. And so I have really kind of dug into it myself in the last 6 months and just, trying to do a lot more testing to really see what works for me and for my brand. And it kind of reminds me of the early days of self-publishing for myself, in that I really find that the more you're involved in your own career, the better you will do. Like when you focus in on something and you really learn it, it's empowering, and it also helps you make better decisions. And I do have a great person who helps me a lot with making graphics and doing some advertising. And I said to her, I just really need to also dig into this myself, because I think I'll be a better partner if I can really understand how it all works. And I think that's really helped me. And I really think that's kind of the success of a lot of the big indie authors, is that they really haven't been afraid to sort of get their hands dirty and sort of figure things out. Because the more middlemen you have between you and your end product, the less control you have and the less you're focused on whether something's working or not. Because you can let things run, and that $5 a day even adds up, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, I just spent a couple $1,000 and I don't even really know what I got for it, because I didn't know how to measure it. I didn't know how to understand it. So I think these courses are really helpful for authors, in that it's not just about making the ad and running the ad, but really measuring it. Is it successful for you? And maybe this works for one person, but it's not going to work for you, because everything is so subjective. So your audience may respond to something else. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's a really nice point, Barbara, as well, that it improves you as a person by challenging yourself to learn something and get to grips with it. I mean, funny enough, I often think the same thing about sport. I play a bit of sport, and I know a lot of people don't, but I get quite nervous in some of the sports I play, and I wonder why I do it. And I think afterwards, because actually you grow a little bit as a person and you put yourself up there. I think this is almost the same thing, because it is a difficult thing for lots of self-published authors to do. A lot of people quite naturally are anxious about the difficulties in learning business and parts of business. But when you do it, as you say, you do grow, and that's got to actually probably make you a better writer.
I think it does. I think it really makes you better in a lot of ways. I think it's all a little scary. And it's funny, because I've been on every retail platform. I know the back ends of every system, because I've been doing it since the beginning. But then when, faced with the Facebook, advertising platform, I had that same like, oh, what do these words mean? What's a lookalike? So it's like, even when you feel like you're kind of experienced, you still have that moment of like, oh, trepidation when you're going to push that button. But there's so much in e-publishing, everything is changeable and removable and easily fixed. So I think that if authors can kind of get over that fear that they're going to do something irrevocably wrong, they'll be a little bit more daring, because it really is not that hard. It just feels like it's hard in the beginning because it feels new and strange. But I do think that challenging, I've always felt like focus is super important. And throughout my career, like there have been moments when, some of the retailers, the newer retailers who've kind of come into the book space, I would think to myself, I'm going to find a way to, get on that platform and do better. I'm going to meet that rep. I'm going to research that website. I'm going to see what features they have. I'm going to put my books up for that. Whenever I've kind of focused in on that, I've really seen a lot more success. And so I that's why I kind of try to encourage authors, like if they're feeling stuck or they've plateaued and they don't know what to do next, is to really like pick one thing and focus on that, whether it's advertising or meeting a retailer or learning, how to make your book look better as an EPUB, whatever it is. I think if you focus in on it, you'll just do so much better in that space. And then you'll move on to the next thing.
Do you have a team now, Barbara? Do you employ people to help you out with the business side?
I have, I have kind of a couple of freelance, kind of specialists. Like I have someone who helps me with social media and advertising and my website. I have a formatter who does, strictly all the formatting. I will say it does help because I do know a lot. And, as authors, sometimes we're kind of running a little last minute and it's Sunday night and, that book really needs to be uploaded. And, these other people have a life and don't really want to work for me at Sunday night at 9:00. So it's great when I can, actually format something myself and throw it up if I have to. But I have kind of built a team of kind of freelance people. I don't have employees, but I have independent contractors that that I work with that, that are great and terrific. And, I'm really happy that I found them, but it takes time. I've had, people who've moved on over the years and suddenly, I'm by myself again for something. So it's, definitely up and down proposition. But I think if you can get some help to do the things you don't really have time or inclination to do, or that free you up to do more writing, that's great.
Well, I guess in any business, it's good that the boss knows how to do everything, right?
Right.
So,
I think it helps. I think you are a better partner, and you're not relying, and, hopefully you have great people working for you, but, sometimes you don't. I mean, I've had, some really big problems in the translation space where I've, especially early on, I hired a bunch of people and then had horrible problems and found out they, would farm out chapters to be translated by different translators. And again, that was a world where I couldn't get that involved because I didn't speak the language. And I think so, you're back to trusting someone to do it right for you. Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. So it helps to be kind of hands-on and know what's going on.
so, Barbara, one of the big differences, I guess, between traditionally published, and you alluded to it earlier, really, was the contact with readers, which becomes much more important and, much easier and a part of being a writer when you're self-published. So where are you now with your relationship with readers? How close is that? How active are you with your readers? How important is it as part of your marketing strategy?
Yeah, the reader relationship is really the most important to me of all the relationships. And I'm definitely much more involved with my readership now. I have a private Facebook, fan group. They go by lots of different names. People call them street teams or fan groups or discussion groups or book groups or whatever you want to call it. But they're kind of the super fans who really want to come and talk to you and talk about your books and talk with each other. And I think that's what's been really great watching evolve over the last couple of years is that, I've kind of got this great group of people who, it's not just about promotion or doing promotional activities. I'm not an author who's very strict about anything. Some author have rules for whether you can be in the group or not, but I'm pretty open. If you want to come in, come in. So it's kind of more of a fun place for people who really, really love to read. And then, of course, I have the main Facebook fan page that, also, has lots more people on it. And then I try to also use my website a little bit more interactively these days. I'm starting to do a little bit more. I don't want to call it a blog because I don't really blog, but I do try to do a few more posts about behind the scenes of a book. So I kind of tie the reader a little bit more to my stories and understanding sort of where I'm coming from. I think it's easier to have a reader relationship too when you can control what books are coming out when, because I can actually respond to the readers as an indie author. So if they say, I want another Calloway book in my popular Calloway series, I can tell them, yes, you're getting it, and it's going to be this character, and it's going to come out on this date. And I can, let them know things way in advance, and I can set up the pre-orders, and I can really kind of respond to what they want. And if they have a question about a book, I can respond right away. It was just a little bit harder in traditional because I wasn't published frequently. And sometimes there would be a year between books, and it was really hard to keep the reader engagement up in between times. And sometimes I couldn't write what they wanted. They wanted the next one. Well, I'm sorry, but my publisher doesn't want me to write that. I'm going to write something else. And of course, they'd go to that too because they're pretty loyal readers. But it's really nice when you can kind of respond. I have some readers who really like the suspense. So I think I'm going to, I'll bring out another suspense title because I know I have, that group of readers who likes that. So I think developing that reader relationship is really, really important. And I don't think you have to worry as a newer author if you're not getting a lot of fan mail or, I think it's really about a very slow build and growth. And sometimes, some authors and what they write really develop kind of a rabid fan base. I mean, I've noticed over the years that, the vampire authors just have the most rabid fans who, are very vocal online and very engaged. But then I'll see, super huge best-selling authors who have very little mention online because maybe their readership just isn't that readership. So I think it's really important not to measure kind of your success by, a vocal, group on the internet, because sometimes I think that becomes kind of an interesting thing. I'll hear, authors, especially newer authors say, well, my readers think I should do this. And I always am asking myself in my head, well, who are your readers and how many are there? Are you listening to 5, really vocal people in your group? Or are you looking at your whole reader base? Because not everyone who talks to you online is your average reader, and they don't necessarily represent, the thousands of people who might be buying your product. So I think it's really good to engage with readers, but not to sort of be too controlled sometimes by kind of a vocal group who may love you, and that's awesome, and it's so flattering and it's wonderful, but sometimes it's not as big as your whole group. So if that makes sense.
So, yeah, it does make sense to be aware of. I mean, you mentioned there was one element that you realised that there was an appetite for more suspense, so you're going to do a bit more of that. Do you think,
Right.
without taking that caveat into account that they don't represent everyone who's buying your books, but do you think your writing has changed subtly or not subtly since you've had a closer relationship with those readers?
I think what's changed is that I really trust myself more. I really trust my own instincts. It's like I know because I do engage with the readers and I do know what they respond to in my books. I think I was saying that it's not so much about plot or a particular character. It's more about kind of story that you're telling, because really people are always responding to an author's voice and the way they tell the story and the things they find interesting. And, I love to do family secrets, and I love to do stories about identity or stories about people being reunited. And so I can kind of add more suspense or less suspense, or make it sweeter, make it sexier or whatever. But it's kind of honing in on what are the core things about your books that people are really responding to, and then being able to do that. And the reason you can do that in indie more also is because you're not, being governed by a couple of big national book buyers who've decided what should be in the romance shelves across the country. And that's truly, there's like 4 people who really influence those trends. So a lot of authors will say to me like, well, how come, I heard that romantic suspense is dead. In fact, I was told romantic suspense was dead when I first started indie publishing, and some of my greatest success books were romantic suspense. But they were only dead because in the print world, the buyers didn't want to buy them anymore. And I understand they have a different audience and they have limited shelf space, but in the indie world, you don't have the trends as much because there's always an audience. Some audiences are bigger and some audiences are hotter. And I always laugh because the vampires come around about every 5 years. So I told my friend who writes vampires, who's now sad that it seems like sales are dwindling a bit, that vampires will be back. Just hang on.
Well, they never die.
They never die. They're immortal, and they come back in fiction all the time. Same with erotic romance, super hot, then not, then 50 Shades comes out and the world changes again. Small town romance, hot, then not. So the trends do come and go, but I think you have to kind of just ride them out and keep focusing in on your core story. And that's what you can do in indie, because you can find some readers out there.
And do you ever meet your readers?
Sometimes I don't do a lot of book signings just because they take a lot of time and I don't always find them to be that productive. So I meet them more at conferences probably than anywhere else, but probably have the biggest relationship is probably online. It's probably true for a lot of people.
I'm just thinking there's 1 or 2 authors who are starting to have these kind of weekend get-togethers, which sort of becomes a part of their experience with their readers. But it seems to work well. I think Marie Force has started doing that sort of thing. So, but that's not on your radar yet.
No, I think it's great that I know she has a lot of success with her reader weekend, and I think that's fantastic. I think sometimes too, it depends on what part of the country you're in. And if you have kind of a strong romance reader base where you are, I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, which isn't as super romance oriented. So I've tended, I've seen much better results when I do big book signings in areas that are, heavily concentrated with more romance readers. So sometimes, there are pockets around the country that are a little bit more. So everything's very expensive out here. So to get people out here is costly. But, so I think it all depends on a lot of different things. I mean, I really enjoy meeting the readers, but I think that the relationship is with the books as well as with the author. So, if they love the books and they don't need to meet me, that's fine too. kind of whatever works.
Barbara, I also want to talk to you about productivity, because you have produced a lot of books, and particularly since you, I know you use some of your back catalogue, but since you turned indie, What's your approach to writing? Do you have word counts per day? Do you have a fixed period of time or fixed period of the day when you write? Are you disciplined about that?
I am much more disciplined as a writer now as an indie because I am controlling my own calendar. I generally write about 4 books a year, sometimes 5. I'm not one of those people who's writing a book a month. Good for them. I just can't do it. So I generally feel like that's pretty much a good pace for me. But to meet my deadlines for the first couple of years of indie publishing, I probably worked harder than I've ever worked in my life. And so I was really working through every vacation and every weekend. So I have tried to be a little bit better in the last year. I've actually put together a spreadsheet and I put all my vacations down and I put my deadlines down, and I try to be a little bit smarter about, not putting a deadline right after a trip so that I'm not like panicked trying to get something written. And I've also changed my thinking a bit more, like the retailers really do need like 2 weeks for your books to get up. And in the early days, we were throwing them up and they're up the next day. But, the weight of material of books that come into these platforms has really, slowed down the process. Of course, hundreds of thousands of writers are now uploading, compared to the early days. So I've tried to build in like a 2-week time period to have my book ready before it actually comes out. And that has actually really helped a lot because then I have those 2 weeks to also really plan my marketing, promotional strategies instead of just being like in a panic, like the book's coming out tomorrow and I just finished writing it. So for me, that's been a big change. And I do try to, I will sometimes put on my spreadsheet word counts, try to, and it does help me a little. I'm probably one of those people that like to lie to myself. It's like exercising. Like if you just go one more lap, it'll be great. And then you go one more lap and then maybe you go a lap and a half. So sometimes having that word count down psychologically, I look at my word count and I go, well, I only need 500 more words. I can write 500 more words. And that kind of helps me keep on track. And I'm definitely a little bit more of a seat of the pants writer. So I do a lot of rewriting. So sometimes it's like, get some words down and then you can go back and fix them.
Yeah, well, we all have our own little psychological tricks, don't we, to get us by, and word counts work for some people. So that's just to pick up on that last point before we round off, Barbara. You're not a great planner for books. You're a panzer, I believe they call it, in self-publishing circles.
Right. Yeah, I do a lot of advanced plotting. I know the major points of a story, but I always find my best work really comes out of being in the moment, being in the story, being in the character's head, trying to figure out what's the worst possible thing that could happen to them at this possible moment. For me, that just is kind of the process that works. I've tried everybody else's strategy at least once, I think, because over the years you think, oh, that sounds like that would be a lot faster. I'll do a character chart, or I'll do this, or I'll do that. I find a lot of pre-writing actually makes me feel like I've already written the story and I don't want to write it anymore. It becomes like a little more boring for me. So I want to sort of discover the story as I go along. But then that makes it harder too. So every writer has to kind of work out their own process, and there's certainly no right or wrong way to do it.
It's been great, Barbara. Absolutely brilliant talking to you. So before we actually sign off, a lot of listeners are at the early stage of their career, and most of it, including myself, usually paralysed with self-doubt about everything, and that nobody wants to read your book and not really knowing where to turn. As somebody who's, you're not even remotely complacent about that, I can hear from the way you're talking, but with somebody with an incredible track record now, the KDP best-selling author of all time, I believe, according to Amazon. What sort of advice would you hand out to somebody who looks up to you and says, where do I start, and what are the key things I should be doing or thinking about now?
I think the main thing from the writing standpoint for the newer author is to write at least 3 books, because you just don't know what you don't know until you get through that whole book. And that's probably true of a lot of things in life. And usually the second book will be easier. A lot of people say, write what you know, but I found that, I ran out of things I knew pretty early on. So sometimes writing what you don't know is actually a great creative spur, because you get to research something new and you get excited about it. And I think there is paralysis in writing. Fear is the biggest problem for writers in all ways. It's fear of writing the wrong thing, fear of writing not something good enough, I remember when I first got like probably my first big contract in traditional publishing, I thought to myself, well, I have to write a better book now because they paid me more money. I mean, that's how writers think, but that's not true. You're always trying to write a better book, whatever the reason, you give yourself. Well, I have to write a better book because now it's my second book or now it's my third book. But I think really writing, a couple of books and really getting your craft down and really concentrating on the quality of your books is super important. And then start to get into all the craziness of all the developing relationships with retailers and promoting and all of that. I think a lot of people write one book and then they spend like the next 3 years trying to sell it. If they just wrote another 2 or 3 books, it's so much easier to sell the third or fourth book than to sell the first book, because people read one, they want to read another one, and you want to kind of grow and you want to kind of build. But fear is always there. You can't tell me there's not one author who 40 books, 50 books, 100 books in still doesn't have some fear in the writing process. And also, once the book is out in the world, it's very subjective, and you have to let readers have their opinions of your work, and you can't let that drive you crazy. So trying to get past the fear and just write and sort of trust your instincts. And if your instincts are steering you wrong, then go out and talk to more people and get help. I mean, writers are such a great network, right? There's just so many places to go where you can talk to other writers and share your frustrations and get help and get support.
Barbara Freethy, what a pleasure talking to Barbara. And I was struck with how completely down to earth Barbara is. There's no highfalutin attitude from her, despite her enormous sales and her status in the industry. Very, very down to earth, very hardworking, very mired in the practicalities of what to do. So it turned out to be not just a sort of inspirational interview as we knew it would be, listening to someone like Barbara, but actually a very practically valuable interview, I think, particularly in terms of the attitude that you need, getting on top of the detail and making things work.
Yeah, and that's something that she shares with a lot of the most successful authors, and especially the authors in the romance genre. They tend to do the best these days, and it's not because they're writing in a genre, or it's not only because they're writing in a genre that has a lot of voracious readers interested in it. It's because they are incredibly smart and incredibly hardworking. Success just doesn't fall out of a tree. It's something that has to be worked at, and they've demonstrated. And Barbara is really key when it comes to this, demonstrating that hard work does lead to success.
Yes, it's that old thing, isn't it? When you have hugely successful people and you're looking for what is their magic ingredient, and you hang on their words trying to work out what this magic thing is that they do that you don't. And it turns out they just do what you do, but they don't give up. They keep working at something until it works, and they keep on top of the detail. And all the things we talk about day to day, week to week, is just what they do better. And there's no reason why you can't do it better, can't lift yourselves and elevate yourselves to get on top of stuff. I'm always reminded, I think it was Gary Player, it's probably just attributed to him, the old Gary Player, the golfer who heard somebody muttering about how lucky he was when he holed a long putt and he was walking off. He said, it's funny, the harder I practice, the luckier I become, which is absolutely right. So yeah, really excited to have Barbara on. So kind of her to join us, and it's thrills all round really to follow her career as she goes from strength to strength. We're going to go next week back to a sort of more practical level, and something that I think is going to be of interest to people who are building up their mailing list now and looking at doing, well, the sort of thing that Barbara does very well and Marie Force before, which is to work with their audience. And he's a guy who's founded a new mailing list in mailing list service in competition, I guess, to MailChimp and the others, out of frustration because he was an author and he felt they didn't really address what he wanted from it. And his name is Nathan Barry. It's called ConvertKit, and it's getting huge plaudits. This is an incredible story. He's very open about his figures as well, jaw-dropping figures when he talks in his interview next week. So stay with us for that one. That'll be podcast number 26. Until then, hopefully with fresh inspiration, Mark, from Barbara, we can all get writing, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do right now.
You've been listening to the Self-Publishing Formula podcast. Visit us at selfpublishingformula.com for more information, show notes, and links on today's topics. You can also sign up for our free video series on using Facebook ads to grow your mailing list. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next time.